Yeah, we got a grand air Trine today. Everything is like moving like this. Leslie the little plastic, Zazoo Plazz, here for our my weekly Zazoo Plazz report. September 21st, 2025. It's a new moon. It's a new moon solar eclipse in Virgo. 29 degrees. It's actually was earlier, so now the moon is in Libra. So it's at 0 degrees of Libra as I'm doing this, give or take, you know. So I think there's so there's a bunch of air, and I feel like I have to hold on because I feel like I'm floating off into space. You know, there's a kite. There's a kite formation. It's I don't go into all the details. It hurts. And you know, so we're at that juncture too between Virgo is details and thinking, and Mercury, and Libra is more like you know, Libra's more like let's all get along, you know, let's be harmonious and let's just get along, you know, let's talk about it, just work it out, you know. And then we get Mars and Leo that comes along like, yeah, I just want to be heard. Just listen to me, my way. And that's squaring Uranus and Taurus, which is like shaking up the resources, you know. So it's you know, it's it's disruptive. Mars and Leo square Uranus and Taurus. It's volatile, you know, self-expression clashing with, you know, versus disruption to security and values, right? So this is perfect. The readings today, and you know, if you look carefully, see, I grew up Catholic. I don't do the whole thing anymore, but you know, it's my foundation, so I draw from it like a well, you know. I'm not in the soup anymore, but I'm kind of, you know, I take a higher approach so that I can combine my astrology, if you're new here, with, you know, my Catholic, with the readings. I look at the readings every week, and I combine that in a big stew with, you know, my Gen X pop culture, you know, that I grew up with, and, you know, serve it to you with a side of crusty bread and a little ranting and retorting and raving and a few epiphanies and some jokes. Groaners usually, but there's a lot of sarcasm mixed in, you know, a little spice. Anyway, so the whole thing, I just did like a whole bunch of posts on my Facebook page today, and I just couldn't stop. I was having so much fun. So, you know, there's that air. Venus is into it. So, yeah, Libra. The moon and the sun are just about at my ascendant, which is the early degrees of Libra. But they're in opposition to Saturn. You know, Saturn is in the last degree of Pisces, and the Neptune's at the beginning of Aries. So there's that opposition. So Neptune and Saturn are sitting at my descendant. That's the opposite of your ascendant. It's kind of like, you know, the thing that's opposite of what you are, you know. So it's interesting hitting me at my, you know, 12th to my first house and my 6th to my 7th house. Kind of like, so, you know, that's an interesting point. Because, you know, Libra is in my first house. That's where we start to look to the other, from the individual signs, which go from Aries to Virgo. Then we enter into relationships with people, right? And resources and work. And, you know, so I find my thoughts today going into, you know, work, professional kinds of experiences I've had and whatnot. Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, I have a few stories. So there's that new moon. I'm going to write out my new moon check. Every month I do that. It's good practice to have some rituals, related to the moon. It keeps me grounded. It gives me a sense of ritual. Since I don't do the whole mass thing, I have my own rituals, and it's meaningful to me. You have to have something meaningful, you know. And to me, it's my daily habits, my monthly habits, things that are meaningful to me, that have to do with nature, or self-care, things that I do for myself. And then from there, I can go on and do nice things for other people if I so wish. See, I can serve in the way that I'm meant to, not just being a slave to anyone, being a doormat, but rather, finding how could my individual skills, help people in this situation, or how, by being my best self, then I help the whole universe just by, me showing up in a high vibration. Other people pick up on it, So that's my thing. Yeah. So I did that. Okay. So yeah, I have two small stories. So I don't own a printer, right? It's back up at the house with my former spouse. He's got like 3 or 4 of them. But I decided when I moved here, I just got my laptop. I said, why do I need a printer? He was always the one, you like paper copies of everything, right? And I was, he had, it's funny, the Gen X male, right? I don't know if other guys do this, but I suspect they might. He had like copies. He saved the manuals from appliances we no longer owned. He had copies, anything that he would do for work, anything, for our personal, records. He would make copies. So there were copies and copies of copies, and I don't do the paper thing much. I'll keep important things, But I have one little drawer with one of those Expand-A-Files, and I have most of my things in there. I do have some other little file folders, for some separate things. One of which was for my car, which he dropped off. And I said, oh, this is nice. I've gotten everything. I scanned everything. When I left the house, I scanned all my damn papers, and I threw things out. And I was nice and light when I started my new life here. I have certain copies, but I just went, for finding investments. I just found out that I selected, no paper, because they were gonna charge me like $500 or something like that. I think that's what I read. They said that they could charge me, a certain percentage of my account if I didn't switch to no paper. So it's a good thing that I did that. So that kind of relates to the readings today. The people who, a lot of corporations, right? People are wealthy, but they make their money in ways like that unsuspecting people might not, realize, and therefore have to pay money, right? And those people will make money from people's lack of knowledge, about these little things. So that's a practical example. But the other thing is, so bottom line, I don't have a printer, but I have certain things for my personal, business, and a couple of things that I had to make copies for this week. And, so usually what I do is I send a PDF down to this office supply store, Staples, right? And so last week, though, I sent it, I think it was Friday, and it was, Friday early or something. And then I ended up going Saturday afternoon. It was more than 24 hours. So I'm trying to scan my phone. You have to like scan your phone. It picks up on the, the barcode that they send you. And then it prints out your stuff, and then you put your card in and you pay for it. So I'm like, standing there for 10 minutes, my phone this way and up. And I said, okay, it could, and then it said something, I read the small print, it said, oh, if it's more than 24 hours, it won't do. I said, well, maybe. So I switched machines, I sent it to myself again, and I tried printing it out, and that, it was, I didn't have the original PDF, so I couldn't do it. This is Gen X, folks. This is the kind of frustration we're dealing with here. So I called the guy over. He looked a lot like my oldest son, about the same age, Gen Z guy. Looked just like my oldest son, who is in computers. He's a, total computer guy. I said, hey, I'm trying to do this, and I have a couple of theories. Can you, he says, yeah, it's more than 24 hours. That's, so whatever. So I was ready to I was going to throw my damn phone through the freaking window. There was some lady, probably a millennial. She's just doing her thing. She's got this little girl and, toddler who's, sucking on some juice box or something. And she's like, and I was just like, I was down to my last nerve with this printer that was not gonna, So I just took a step back and I said, okay. I said, you know what? I had a sense when I left my front door, I was, and I can be up for 20 hours. I don't sleep much. I knew that it was pushing it, but I want, and then I had to go to Job Lot and get my snacks, my cashews and trail mix, which I did after. And they were out of my coffee, my hazelnut coffee. But I knew when I stepped out the door that it was pushing it. I said, you know what? I'm pretty tired. I shouldn't do this, but I did it anyway. I stepped out the door, and there's this squirrel in this tree. It's a honey locust tree. And he's sitting there. He's looking right at me. And he's making this, like he's yelling at me, trying to tell me something. This damn squirrel went on yelling at me for about 5 minutes. So I took a video of him. I said, what's he trying to tell me? She was telling me to get back in the house. And then, I get in the car and things are, my neighbor, she gets out of her car and I don't know, she backs in. So when she opens her door to get out of her car, she's like this and I'm like this. So, whatever, whatever. It's, anyway, okay, enough ranting. Squirrel, staples, okay. I had to get that off my chest. Okay, so let's see. Zazoo, get to it. Okay, Book of Amos. Famous Amos. He was first prophet in the Old Testament with a book named after him. He was a prophet. He accurately predicted Israel's, problems, eventual, everything that went on there. I'm not going to go into it. But, he was right. So he was an arborist. He was a dresser of sycamores. That's funny. So he wasn't a priest. He wasn't like, he was a simple man. Therefore he was open to receiving these oracles. Like these, I watch all these, people with their oracle cards and tarot cards on YouTube. I'm kind of a little bit addicted to it. Some of them are pretty good. So, he was denouncing idolatry, idolatry, worshiping idols, and greed and injustice, against the poor, right? So this is relevant. He was protesting against, trampling the needy and the poor, and it says, when will the new moon be over, you ask, and the Sabbath, so I can display my wheat. I mean, that says it all right there, in other words, pushing aside the spiritual things. People who are the children of the light versus the children of this earth, the matrix versus the higher, the higher realms, the 5D, So that's what we're dealing with here. So some people are really good at navigating those lower, the material world, right? And those are the people he's talking about. The people who can't wait to get out of church so that they can, beat everybody out of the parking lot and go and, have brunch or whatever. They're in church and they're thinking about some sale that they're going to make, or, you get the idea. Somebody who's the mind and is not in the right place. In other words, you can't serve two masters, right? If you're in church and you're thinking about your business, and there goes my fridge, you're torn, okay? So anyway, you're a hypocrite, basically. He's calling out hypocrites, people who, are not, they're not, anyway, we'll get to that later. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. He talks about people who fix the scales, right? They massage the numbers, so to speak. And I used to be in finance, and I worked in a lot of those kind of places. Let's just leave it at that, and that's why I had so many jobs, because I left places when I found out that there were things that I couldn't abide going on there. Even though when I was there, I tried to find ways to be of service, to help and to try to turn things around. And I think I did that, because a lot of places I left, and then I found out, I left and I found out that there were shady things going on. And then after I left, I found out that those places kind of fell apart, after I left. So I think I had some kind of effect, kind of cleaning things up. Just saying, anyway. Psalm, praise the Lord who lifts up the poor. So he raises the lowly from the dust and from the dunghill, raises the poor to sit with princes. I like that. So, you can be working in a corporation, but you can have higher ideals. In other words, you don't have to sink to the level of, those who, might have gotten wealthy through exploiting people who are, unknowing, people who are, just honest people trying to, go about their life, people who invested their money, people who've, bought certain products or trusted that companies were going to do right by them, And sometimes that doesn't happen because, companies have to make money, for the shareholders, for the this, the that, fill in the blanks. This is not new. Okay, so we're in Libra season, So that's the flavor I'm getting. Liber is the mediator, right? So Paul, first letter to Timothy, he asks for prayers and thanks, for those in authority, because not everyone is, some people, he's asking for those, in authority, positions of responsibility, to be responsible, so that all of us can live in peace, in dignity. So, because he said God wants us all to be saved and to know the truth. Okay, so he says there's one God and one mediator, who is Jesus, right? Who he talks about is Jesus, going between the divine and the earthly, of us, between us, right? So he said Jesus was rich, and he became, okay, this is Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So he gave up his riches to become poor so that we could be rich, right? In other words, the riches not of this world, right? He, what Jesus brought was a wealth in beyond, right? The real wealth, which is eternal life, the kingdom of God that's promised, right? That's, there's that thing there. Mars square Uranus, Leo versus Taurus, that conflict between, me, my shining, my light in the world, versus, in other words, the Mars in Leo, that's fire, right? Passion for what I want to do, versus, Uranus and Taurus is shaken up, the security of the material world. So there's that conflict there, which shows up in this. So the Gospel of the week is Luke 16. So Jesus tells this parable, right? This shrewd manager. So there's this rich man who, it's assumed, got his money off the backs of, other people. It's assumed. It doesn't say that. Some people perhaps have, gotten their wealth. But we're talking extreme wealth. It's not just someone who's been, worked hard and made a lot of money. This is extreme. We're talking, probably like a billionaire, and for those times. And, there's a lot of talk about that these days. We're talking someone with, like, filthy money, filthy rich money, whatever. Who has a steward, right? So the steward is like someone who is entrusted with, like a business manager, like, you hear about these, like, rock stars or celebrities who have business managers who they trust to take care of their, affairs. And sometimes, you hear about them not doing such a good job and losing their money, or taking their, pocketing some of the money, and, it comes out, though. The truth comes out in the end, and you hear all about it. And the rich guy calls the steward in and said, "What's this I hear about you, doing me dirty?" And so fires the guy, and he's like, what else am I going to do for a living? I've got to scramble here and, call in some of this guy's debts so that I can make friends, with these people. So this is an airy kind of guy, right? This is a shrewd. He's not responding by getting all hot and bothered and, throwing stuff. He's calling in the networks. He's looking in his, we used to have those things with the cards, and it used to spin around, and what was it called? I haven't used one in so long. But people used to have those on their desks. And, it would have like, if you had to call somebody, you wouldn't have your number in your smartphone because there weren't any. You'd like, we'd have like a card catalog with people's names on the, because I was in sales. So I had one of these like boxes on my desk. It wasn't the fancy kind that spun around. It was just, like I have everybody's number written on a little card. And, you'd have that friend you'd call in a favor, or, you owe them one or whatever. And so he goes back to his office. He knows he's getting canned. So he's, calling in this one. He'd say, oh, you owe this guy 100. How about 50? Do this. How about 80? He starts making deals, right? So these people then feel like they owe him, right? It's not his money, but he's doing, he's so the master was impressed. He kind of landed on his feet, and he helped. He decided to, help some people who couldn't afford to pay, the whole amount. At least he got something. So he sort of redeemed himself a little bit here. So he showed himself more trustworthy with the little things, even though he was in an environment that, it wasn't his money. What does he care, right? It's the guy's money. It's the rich guy's money. He's probably like, the heck with him. He's got more than enough money. I'm going to, get some for me. So then he, but he's shrewd. So you kind of can't blame, you can kind of sympathize with him a little bit. I don't know, empathize, but you could see where he's coming from. Where he's like, this guy's got so much money, why he's not going to miss it. But God is saying, if you're dishonest with even that kind of thing, what are you going to do with, how are you ever going to get anything of your own, right? In other words, nothing of this earth belongs to us. None of it. It's on loan while we're here. But those things that are meant for us, our soul work, that is ours. That's really ours. Really, our mistakes and our success, our soul work is really the only thing, and our love that we can take with us, that we can truly call our own. Our mistakes, our experiences, right? Our love for other people, right? The things we've done to help other people, that we take with us, right? None of this stuff doesn't matter. So, in other words, if God is saying, Jesus is saying, sometimes if you're on the spiritual path, you don't care much about the material stuff, right? So you're not going to be that kind of a shrewd person, right? But so now we get to the song. Okay, enough of that. And I realize I've used this song before in another Zazoo report, but it's been a while. So I just love it. Tom Petty, Refugee, released January 11th, 1980. So I was a freshman in high school. Yeah. Second single from his Damn the Torpedoes album. And I know I've talked about this before, but every time I bring it back, it's new. So basically, Tom Petty, okay, he was frustrated with his record label because they were, record label obviously makes money off artists, and you can extend this to, you think about, okay, most people, we grew up being able to go to concerts, for like $25 or something. And now that's not the case. So I'll leave that right there. But, say his record label, obviously they make their money from, wheeling and dealing in artists work, their songs. He found out they were trying to sell his contract without his knowledge, okay? So, so he wrote a song. He was very frustrated. He was angry. He wrote a song in 10 minutes. And, then, you put the song out there to help other people who might also feel like they, who also felt like that, maybe trapped, not having your personal freedom and control, right? That's Mars and Leo versus they were messing, Uranus in Taurus. Obviously that was a shock about his personal, that affected his personal assets, which is, his art, his songs, right? That's a shock. Like what? That's his livelihood, right? So, anyway, angry at the system, right? So, some of the lyrics, it was a theme of personal freedom and survival. When you feel like your survival's at stake, what do you do, right? So he wrote a song, so he could then he could help other people and make money from the song, right? So he did that. Actually, Mike Campbell wrote the music, and Tom Petty put words over it. He felt, it needed lifting up. But instead of changing the guy's chorus, he wrote the words to lift it up. I guess Mike Campbell said it took them a long time to record this, and they had to record it. He said it felt like 100 times, and he was so frustrated he took off. Then when he came back, they put it all together. But that's Virgo, that perfectionist, right? Versus Libra, working things out. See that? And Tom Petty was a Libra, October 20th. So they said it was a gutsy rock song, searing guitar, power and passion. And so the reason I picked it said that Jesus was the ransom for all, right? And I thought, tied up, taken away, and held for ransom. You've been kicked around somewhere. Somebody kicked you around. He said, you're not going to revel in your abandon, right? Everybody's got the right to be free. This is perfect. In other words, the guy who, the steward, he could have reveled rolled around in his being abandoned, being fired, in other words, feel sorry for yourself. Revel in your abandonness. Poor me, right? Oh, poor me. Instead of doing something, harnessing that emotion into something creative, right? So that's what we're being called to do, I think. Jesus is telling us, instead of, yes, you're angry at things, you want things to be better, but you gotta sometimes, figure out how to work through it in a creative, responsible way. Instead of a destructive way, think of a way to help someone and then you'll be helped in return. See? Okay, Zazoo, you're getting way off track here. Okay, time to wrap it up. You'll have your paleo hot chocolate and your cashew butters and ice cake. I gotta make turkey noodle casserole today. Anyway, I guess I'm gonna go. Yeah. So I definitely feel the energy is getting lighter. But I gotta be careful not to burn out. Because sometimes I get going and I kind of go off. I kind of ground myself. So anyway, I'll go for a walk later. It's a nice night. So yeah, I hope, welcome to Libra season, and enjoy the new moon and make your intentions. Don't get too bogged down in the details. Have some fun. So, enjoy. See you next week. Same place, different time. Take care.